My husband said, "If you don't trust me hanging out with my ex-wife every weekend, maybe we shouldn't be together." I replied, "You're absolutely right." Then I accepted the job transfer to London I'd been declining for him. When he texted, "What are you doing this weekend?" I sent a selfie from Heathrow Airport. My name is Trisha, and at 31 years old, I thought I had this whole adulting thing figured out. Spoiler alert, I absolutely did not. 3 years of marriage to Jonathan had given me a false sense of security, like those people who think they're invincible because they've never been in a car accident. We had what everyone calls the good life. You know, the kind that looks perfect on Instagram but feels like watching paint dry in real time. Jonathan was 29, which in hindsight should have been my first red flag. Not because of his age, but because he still acted like he was 22, and discovering himself through bad decisions and overpriced coffee. But hey, love makes you stupid, and I was practically brain dead when it came to him. We had the whole suburban dream package: steady jobs that we complained about but never quit, a shared apartment that we pretended to love but secretly knew was overpriced, and those adorable 5-year plans that couples make when they're high on optimism and low on real-world experience. Everything was cruising along in that beautifully boring way that makes your parents proud and your single friends jealous. I should have known the universe was just setting me up for the cosmic punchline of my life, because that is when Sophie decided to make her grand re-entrance into our perfectly choreographed existence. Sophie, even her name sounds like the kind of woman who orders wine at Applebee's and acts like she knows what she's talking about. She was Jonathan's ex-wife. Yeah, you read that right. Ex-wife, because apparently my husband had been married before and thought mentioning it casually 6 months into our relationship was totally normal timing. Oh, by the way, I was married to this woman Sophie for 2 years, but it didn't work out because she was emotionally unavailable and had commitment issues. Classic red flag disguised as vulnerability. But I was too whipped to see it. So when Ms. Emotionally Unavailable decided to grace our little town with her presence again, Jonathan suddenly developed this overwhelming urge to catch up. And by catch up, I mean systematically replaced every weekend activity we used to do together with Sophie-themed adventures. It started innocent enough. Saturday brunch at that overpriced cafe downtown where they serve $12 avocado toast and call it artisanal, because nothing says just friends like spending your Saturday morning staring into your ex-wife's eyes over Eggs Benedict. But of course, it didn't stop there. It never does it? Saturday brunch evolved into Sunday walks through the park because Sophie was apparently going through some sort of existential crisis and needed Jonathan's unique brand of emotional support. You know, the kind that requires long, meaningful conversations while strolling past happy families and couples who actually spend weekends together. Then came the Friday movie nights because poor Sophie was going through a rough patch and needed someone to hold her hand through the latest Marvel movie. Funny how her rough patch seemed to coincide perfectly with our date nights. I tried to be the understanding wife. Really, I did. I channeled every piece of marriage advice I'd ever ignored and attempted to trust my husband. But trust is a funny thing. It's like trying to ignore a mosquito buzzing around your head. You can pretend it's not there for a while, but eventually you're going to get bit, and it's going to itch like hell. The signs were everywhere, but I was apparently fluent in denial. Jonathan started wearing this cologne he'd never worn for me. Something expensive and musky that made our apartment smell like a department store. He'd spend an hour doing his hair for these casual friend meetings, styling it in ways that suggested these hangouts were anything but casual. And don't even get me started on the phone situation. My husband, who used to barely glance at his phone during our conversations, was suddenly grinning at text messages like a teenager with his first crush. The worst part? He laughed at his phone more than he laughed at my jokes. And let me tell you, my jokes are comedy gold. Okay, maybe comedy bronze, but still. When your husband finds his phone more entertaining than you, it's time to reevaluate some life choices. Enter the supporting cast of this tragic comedy, Laya, Jonathan's best friend, who had apparently appointed herself as the official cheerleader for this disaster in the making. Laya was one of those friends who gives terrible advice with complete confidence. Like a GPS that's constantly recalculating, but never actually gets you where you need to go. "Trisha," she'd say with that condescending smile, "you need to understand that exes can absolutely be just friends. It's actually really mature and healthy." Right. Because nothing screams emotional maturity like spending every weekend with the person you divorced. Then there was Jordan, my best buddy, and the voice of reason I chose to ignore. Jordan had this amazing ability to raise his eyebrows in a way that said, "Girl, are you seriously not seeing this?" without actually having to voice his concerns. He'd give me that look every time I mentioned Jonathan's weekend plans, but being the good friend he was, he'd just tell me to keep cool and trust the process. The process, as it turned out, was my marriage slowly imploding while I pretended everything was fine. But I tried. God help me, I really tried to keep cool. I practiced the art of fake smiling when Jonathan would come home glowing from his friend dates. I bit my tongue when he'd spend an hour getting ready for coffee with Sophie. I even managed to nod along when he'd tell me about their deep conversations and shared memories, as if I was supposed to be happy that my husband was emotionally reconnecting with his ex-wife every weekend. The unease grew like a tumor in my chest, feeding on every canceled plan, every secretive phone call, and every time he chose Sophie over me. But I kept telling myself I was being paranoid, that I was the problem, that maybe I needed to be more secure in my marriage. What I didn't realize was that my marriage was already over. I was just the last one to get the memo. The breaking point didn't come with some dramatic revelation or catching them in bed together like you see in the movies. No, it arrived on a perfectly ordinary Saturday morning with the subtlety of a freight train to the face. I was sitting at our kitchen table drinking coffee that had gone cold while I pretended to read the news on my phone when Jonathan emerged from our bedroom looking like he was headed to a damn photo shoot. He'd done that thing with his hair again. You know, the effortless, but actually took an hour look that he perfected for his Sophie dates. The cologne cloud hit me before he even entered the kitchen, and I swear I could practically see the cartoon stink lines wafting off him. He was wearing this shirt I bought him for our anniversary last year, the one he claimed was too fancy for everyday wear, but apparently just fancy enough for casual Saturday hangouts with his ex-wife. "Morning, babe," he chirped, grabbing his wallet and checking his reflection in the toaster. Because nothing says authentic relationship like using kitchen appliances as mirrors, while your wife sits 3 feet away. I looked up from my phone where I'd been scrolling through the same article about cryptocurrency for the past 20 minutes without absorbing a single word. "Let me guess," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Another emergency Sophie session?" He paused, and for a split second I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt, maybe, or annoyance that I dared to question his Saturday ritual. "We're just getting coffee, Trisha. She's still going through that rough patch." Right, the rough patch. Sophie's mysterious life crisis that apparently required more attention than a newborn baby and had been going on for 3 months now. I wondered what exactly constituted this rough patch. Was it her inability to find a decent apartment? Her struggle with commitment issues? Or maybe just the devastating realization that she'd let Jonathan slip away? My money was on the latter. "Actually," I said, setting down my phone and looking directly at him, "I was thinking we could try that new place downtown today. You know, the one with the bottomless mimosas you've been talking about for weeks." The suggestion hung in the air like a bad smell. Jonathan's face went through this amazing transformation. Confusion, then irritation, then that special kind of exasperation reserved for husbands who dare to be asked to spend time with their wives. He rolled his eyes with the dramatic flair of a teenager being asked to clean his room. "Trisha, we've been over this like a million times. Sophie and I are just friends. We're adults. We can handle having a platonic relationship." I nodded slowly. "Platonic? Got it. That's why you're wearing the anniversary shirt and enough cologne to knock out a horse." "Don't be ridiculous," he snapped, but his hand instinctively went to smooth down the shirt. I always dress nicely when I go out. That was rich. The man who wore sweatpants to the grocery store and considered shaving an optional holiday suddenly had standards for coffee dates with his ex. But I wasn't done yet. Call it masochistic, but I needed to hear him say it. "So skip it today," I said simply. "One Saturday. Stay home with your wife. We'll make pancakes, binge watch something terrible on Netflix, maybe even have actual conversations that don't revolve around Sophie's emotional well-being." You would have thought I'd asked him to donate a kidney. His face contorted like I'd just suggested we murder puppies for fun. "I can't just bail on her, Trisha. She's expecting me." And there it was, the truth wrapped up in a neat little package with a bow on top. Sophie was expecting him, not hoping to see him, not casually available if he happened to be free, but expecting him like he was her employee, her therapy appointment, her guaranteed Saturday morning entertainment. What about what I'm expecting? I asked, and even I could hear the edge creeping into my voice. What about the fact that your wife might want to spend time with you occasionally? That's when he delivered the line that would change everything. The words that would replay in my head for weeks afterward like a broken record. He straightened up, put his hands on his hips, and looked at me with the kind of conviction usually reserved for courtroom dramas and political debates. If you don't trust me hanging out with my ex-wife every weekend, maybe we shouldn't be together. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, a car starting somewhere down the street, the hum of our refrigerator that I'd been meaning to fix for months. But mostly, I could hear the sound of my marriage officially ending, even though neither of us realized it yet. I looked at him for a long time, really looked at him. This man I'd promised to love and cherish, who was now standing in our kitchen wearing my anniversary gift to meet another woman while giving me ultimatums about trust. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "You're absolutely right," I said finally, my voice calmer than I felt. His face twisted in confusion like a computer trying to process conflicting commands. This clearly wasn't the response he'd been expecting. He'd probably anticipated tears, begging, maybe even a good old-fashioned fight where I'd storm out and he could text Sophie about what an unreasonable wife he had. But I meant it, every single word, because in that moment, sitting in our kitchen, while he stood there ready to choose his ex-wife over me for the umpteenth time, I realized something profound. I was done. Not just with the Sophie situation, not just with the disrespect and the lying by omission, but with the entire charade of pretending this marriage was salvageable. You see, for months I'd been sitting on something that Jonathan didn't know about, something big. My company had offered me a dream position, a transfer to their London office with a salary that would make our current financial situation look like pocket change. We're talking $130,000 a year, plus a fully furnished 3-bedroom flat overlooking the Thames, plus my own team to manage. It was the kind of opportunity that career counselors write fantasies about. I'd turned it down twice because every time I brought up the possibility of moving, Jonathan would shut it down faster than a nightclub at closing time. "I can't leave my family, Trisha. My whole life is here. What about my job? What about my friends?" What he really meant was, "What about Sophie?" "Well, congratulations, Jonathan. You just solved that problem for me." That night, after he'd flounced out for his coffee date with his friend, I sat down at my laptop and composed the email that would change my life. The subject line was simple: London position acceptance. The message was even simpler: "I'll take it. When can I start?" The response came back within 2 hours. 2 weeks. Welcome to the team. I smiled for the first time in months. The next morning, Jonathan woke up with that post-ultimatum regret that hits people like a hangover after a night of drunk texting their ex. You know the feeling when you realize you've said something monumentally stupid, and now you have to figure out how to backpedal without looking like a complete idiot. Spoiler alert, there's no graceful way to do it. He shuffled into the kitchen where I was already dressed and drinking coffee, scrolling through apartment listings in London like a woman who'd just discovered Christmas morning. The panic in his eyes was almost comical, like a cartoon character who just realized he'd walked off a cliff and was about to plummet into the canyon below. "Trisha," he started, his voice doing that weird thing where it goes up at the end, like he's asking a question even though he's making a statement. "About yesterday, I think maybe we should talk." I looked up from my phone where I'd been admiring a particularly nice flat in Canary Wharf. "Talk about what exactly? Your coffee date with Sophie? How it went? Whether you two discussed our marriage over lattes and croissants?" His face went through that familiar color-changing routine. Pale to pink, to red, to that special shade of mortified that people get when they realize they've screwed up beyond repair. We didn't, Trisha, I think you misunderstood what I said yesterday." Oh, this was rich. The classic "you misunderstood me" defense, as if the English language had suddenly become too complicated for my simple brain to comprehend. I set down my phone and gave him my full attention because this was going to be good. "Really? Help me understand then. When you said, and I quote, 'If you don't trust me hanging out with my ex-wife every weekend, maybe we shouldn't be together.' What exactly did you mean? Because to my admittedly limited understanding, that sounded like an ultimatum." He started doing that thing people do when they're caught in their own trap, the rapid-fire explanation that somehow makes everything worse. "I was just frustrated, okay? You've been so jealous and suspicious lately. and I felt like you were trying to control who I could be friends with. I didn't mean we should actually break up. I just meant that trust is important in a relationship. Trust, the magic word that cheaters use when they want to gaslight you into thinking you're the problem. You're absolutely right, I said, standing up and grabbing my car keys. Trust is important. So is respect and common sense. And not spending every weekend with your ex-wife while your actual wife sits at home like a chump. That's when the waterworks started. Jonathan's eyes filled up like a broken dam, and suddenly, I was the villain in this story. Amazing how quickly the script flips when people realize there are consequences for their actions. "Where are you going?" he sniffled, like I was abandoning him to join the French Foreign Legion instead of just heading to work. "London," I said simply. "I accepted the transfer yesterday. I start in 2 weeks." The silence that followed was so complete I could have heard a pin drop in the next zip code. Jonathan's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air, his brain apparently unable to process the information I'd just delivered. "You what? You can't— we never discussed— Trisha, you can't just decide to move to London without talking to me." The irony was so beautiful, it almost brought a tear to my eye. The same man who'd been making unilateral decisions about our weekends for months was suddenly concerned about couple communication. "Funny thing about ultimatums, Jonathan," I said, heading for the door. "When you give someone an either-or choice, you have to be prepared for them to pick the option you don't want." I left him standing in our kitchen, still in his pajamas, looking like someone had just told him that Santa Claus wasn't real, and the Easter Bunny was actually a registered sex offender. The next 2 weeks were like living in a reality TV show where the producers had decided to crank up the drama to 11. Jonathan went through all 5 stages of grief, sometimes cycling through them multiple times in a single day. It was exhausting to watch and even more exhausting to live through. First came denial. He kept insisting I was being dramatic and that I'd come to my senses once I cooled down. He actually used air quotes when he said it, like my completely rational response to his ultimatum was some sort of emotional breakdown that would pass like a bad case of the flu. Then came anger. Oh boy, the anger. Jonathan turned into a one-man demolition crew, slamming doors and throwing around accusations like confetti at a divorce party. I was abandoning him for money. I was running away from my problems. I was emotionally immature and couldn't handle him having female friends. The last one was particularly hilarious, considering his female friend was texting him at midnight and taking him to romantic restaurants every weekend. Bargaining was my personal favorite stage. Suddenly, Jonathan was full of compromises and solutions that had apparently never occurred to him during the 3 months of Sophie Fest. "What if I only see her once a month? What if you come with us? What if we do couples therapy?" "Too little, too late, sweetheart. You don't get to renegotiate the terms after you've already blown up the contract." Depression hit when he realized I wasn't bluffing. I came home one day to find him sitting on our couch in the same clothes he'd worn the day before, surrounded by tissues like he was preparing for the world's saddest snowball fight. "I can't believe you're really leaving me," he sobbed. "How can you just throw away 3 years of marriage?" "I'm not throwing it away," I replied, continuing to pack my boxes with the efficiency of a woman who'd finally found her purpose in life. "You already did that. I'm just cleaning up the mess." But the real magic happened when I started packing his stuff, too. See, here's the thing about our apartment that Jonathan had conveniently forgotten during his victim tour. The lease was in my name, only my name, because when we'd moved in together, he'd insisted on keeping his parents' address for tax purposes, a cute little euphemism for "I want to dodge my civic responsibilities while still enjoying all the benefits of adult life." I packed his belongings with the care and attention of a professional moving service, organized everything neatly in boxes, and placed them by the front door like a thoughtful wife, preparing for her husband's extended vacation. The look on his face when he came home to find his entire life summarized in cardboard containers was absolutely priceless. "You can't kick me out," he screamed, apparently forgetting that he'd never legally moved in. "This is my home, too." "Actually," I said, pulling out the lease agreement that I'd thoughtfully highlighted for his convenience, "this is my home. You've been a guest. A very welcome guest for 3 years, but legally speaking, just a guest. And now the guest room is needed for other purposes." That's when Jonathan ran to our friends, because nothing says mature adult handling a relationship crisis like running to mommy and daddy. Or in this case to Jordan and Leia and anyone else who would listen to his tale of woe about how his heartless wife was abandoning him for filthy lucre. But here's where the story gets interesting. Remember Jordan, my best buddy with the expressive eyebrows? Well, Jordan had been doing some detective work of his own. The morning of my flight to London, I was feeling pretty damn good about life. My bags were packed, my new apartment keys were waiting for me across the pond, and I had that special kind of zen that comes from finally making a decision that doesn't suck. I was sipping my coffee and scrolling through my phone, mentally calculating what time it would be when I landed, when the doorbell rang like the opening notes of a funeral march. I opened the door to find Jonathan flanked by his personal cavalry, his mother Teresa and his younger sister Hannah. They looked like they were heading to either a funeral or an intervention, which, considering the circumstances, was probably accurate on both counts. Teresa was clutching her purse like it contained the nuclear launch codes, while Hannah looked like she'd rather be literally anywhere else on planet Earth. "Trisha, sweetheart," Teresa began, pushing past me into the apartment with the confidence of someone who'd clearly been planning this ambush for days. "We need to talk." Oh, this was going to be good. I gestured them toward the living room, where my suitcases stood like silent witnesses to my impending freedom. Jonathan immediately started eyeing them like they were ticking time bombs, while Teresa positioned herself on the couch like she was conducting a boardroom meeting. "This sudden move to London," Teresa continued, her voice dripping with that special brand of maternal concern that makes you feel like you're 12 years old and in trouble for breaking the neighbor's window. "It's clearly a cry for help, Trisha. You're having some sort of breakdown, and instead of working through it like adults, you're running away." A cry for help, right? Because accepting a dream job with a massive salary increase and escaping a marriage that had become more toxic than a Chernobyl picnic was obviously the behavior of someone who had lost her marbles. I nodded thoughtfully, like I was really considering her psychological assessment. "You're throwing your life away," she pressed on, warming up to her theme like a preacher hitting his stride. 3 years of marriage. All the memories you and Jonathan have built together, your home, your friends, all of it gone because you're having some sort of midlife crisis. Midlife crisis. I was 31. If this was my midlife crisis, it meant I was going to die at 62, which, considering how the last few months had gone, didn't sound entirely unreasonable. Hannah chimed in next, because apparently this was a tag team intervention. "What about Jonathan?" she demanded, shooting her brother a look that was equal parts sympathy and exasperation. "You can't just leave him behind like he doesn't matter. He loves you, Trisha. He made a mistake. Sure, but everyone makes mistakes." A mistake, singular. As if Jonathan's 3-month emotional affair with his ex-wife was just an oops moment, like accidentally putting salt in his coffee or wearing mismatched socks. I was impressed by their ability to minimize the situation with such artistic flair. Jonathan himself had been unusually quiet during this opening salvo, probably because he was still processing the sight of my packed luggage. But now he stepped forward, tears already forming in his eyes like he was an actor who'd been preparing for this scene his entire life. "Trisha," he whispered, his voice breaking just enough to sound authentically heartbroken. "Please don't do this. We can work through this. I'll stop seeing Sophie. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't leave me." And there it was, the performance I'd been expecting. The tearful confession, the promises to change, the desperate bargaining that comes when people realize they've pushed someone too far and the consequences are finally catching up with them. It might have been touching if it hadn't come about 3 months and 17 Sophie dates too late. I looked at the three of them, Teresa with her righteous indignation, Hannah with her misplaced loyalty, and Jonathan with his crocodile tears, and realized this was the perfect moment for the grand finale, the pièce de résistance that Jordan had uncovered through his detective work. "That's really touching, Jonathan," I said, pulling out my phone. "But before we get too deep into the whole redemption arc, there's something I think everyone should see." I opened the screenshots that Jordan had forwarded to me and held up my phone so all three could see them clearly. The messages were from Sophie's private gym chat group, where she'd been bragging to her workout buddies about her conquest like some sort of suburban Casanova. "Book club is just code," read the first message. "She's basically single now. 3 months of coffee dates, and she's already planning to leave her husband for me." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Teresa's face went white. Hannah's mouth dropped open, and Jonathan looked like someone had just told him his lottery ticket was a fake. But wait, there was more. The next screenshot was even better. "Her wife is such a cluck. Doesn't even know we've been hooking up in my car after every coffee date. She tells her we're just friends." That last message hit Jonathan like a physical blow. His face went from white to green to red in about 3 seconds, cycling through colors like a broken traffic light. Teresa slowly sank back into the couch, her intervention speech apparently forgotten in the face of actual evidence. Context! Jonathan suddenly screamed, finding his voice again. You don't understand the context. She was lying to her friends. She was making it sound like more than it was. Context. The refuge of the caught cheater. What context exactly? I asked mildly. The context where you've been lying to me for 3 months? The context where you've been meeting your ex-wife every weekend while telling me it was innocent? Or the context where you gave me an ultimatum yesterday about trusting you? Hannah was looking at her brother like she'd never seen him before, which was probably accurate. Teresa had gone completely silent, apparently realizing that her son's marriage problems were a bit more complicated than she'd originally thought. This is all taken out of context, Jonathan insisted, but his voice had lost all its conviction. He sounded like a defense attorney who just realized her client was guilty as sin, and the jury had already made up their minds. I looked at each of them in turn, letting the weight of the evidence settle in the room like dust after an explosion. If you didn't mean the ultimatum, I said finally, you shouldn't have given it. That ended the discussion more effectively than a gavel in a courtroom. Teresa gathered her purse and stood up without another word, apparently deciding that strategic retreat was better than continued engagement. Hannah followed suit, shooting Jonathan a look that suggested there would be some very interesting conversations in the family group chat later. Jonathan made one last desperate attempt at damage control. Trisha, please. My flight leaves in 4 hours, I interrupted, checking my watch with the casual efficiency of a woman who had places to be and lives to live. Jordan's coming to pick me up in 20 minutes. You might want to call Sophie. I'm sure she'll be very comforting during this difficult time. As they filed out of my apartment, my former apartment, I should say, Jonathan turned back one more time. What am I supposed to do now? I don't know, I replied honestly, but I'm sure you'll figure it out. You're very resourceful when it comes to making plans. The door closed behind them with a satisfying click, and I was alone with my suitcases and my freedom. Landing at Heathrow was like stepping into a different universe where the air actually tasted like possibility instead of disappointment and betrayal. I'd left behind the smoking wreckage of my marriage and walked straight into what felt like the opening scene of a movie where the protagonist finally gets her life together. The kind of movie where the woman starts off beaten down and ends up running through the airport in slow motion while inspirational music plays in the background. And my new flat was everything the company had promised and more. Located in Canary Wharf, it overlooked the Thames with floor-to-ceiling windows that made me feel like I was living inside a screensaver. 3 bedrooms, a modern kitchen, and a view that made Jonathan's precious hometown look like a strip mall parking lot. Every morning, I'd wake up and look out at the river, watching the boats go by while drinking coffee that actually tasted good because it wasn't seasoned with resentment and marital dysfunction. The office was a revelation, too. My colleagues were sharp, ambitious people who treated work like something they actually wanted to excel at, rather than just a way to pay for weekend drama sessions with ex-wives. My new team was hungry, innovative, and refreshingly free of anyone named Sophie. For the first time in years, I was excited about Monday mornings instead of dreading them like a dental appointment. Meanwhile, back in the land of the free and home of the emotionally immature, Jonathan was apparently struggling with the concept that actions have consequences. According to my LinkedIn feed, he decided to take his grievances public, posting one of those vague social media manifestos that divorced people love so much. When someone you love abandons you without warning for money and career advancement, it really shows you who they truly are, he'd written, along with some inspirational quote about surviving betrayal and finding strength in solitude. The post was accompanied by a black and white photo of him looking pensively out a window, because nothing says authentic emotional pain like a carefully staged Instagram moment. But here's the thing about small towns and social media. Everyone knows everyone's business, and Jonathan had apparently forgotten that our entire social circle had been watching his Sophie show for the past 3 months. The comments on his post were absolutely brutal in that passive-aggressive way that only Facebook comments can achieve. "Didn't you dump her for Sophie, though?" wrote Jessica from his yoga class. "Bro, we saw your stories every weekend with your friend," added someone named Mike with about 17 crying, laughing emojis. "Maybe check the dictionary definition of abandonment before using it," suggested Karen from my old office, who'd apparently been keeping track of the drama like it was her personal soap opera. The post disappeared within 6 hours. which was probably a new record for social media regret. But the internet is forever, and screenshots had already made their way into various group chats and private messages. Jonathan's attempt at controlling the narrative had backfired spectacularly, like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. Then came the plot twist I hadn't seen coming, though in hindsight it was inevitable. Sophie's boyfriend, yes, she had a boyfriend this whole time, because of course she did, decided to reach out to me through LinkedIn. His name was Adrian, and he was apparently everything Jonathan wasn't: direct, honest, and refreshingly free of nonsense. "I think we need to talk," his message read. "Sophie has been lying to both of us." Adrian, it turned out, was a paralegal who'd been dating Sophie for 8 months. He believed her story about Jonathan being a crazy ex-husband who was obsessed with her and wouldn't leave her alone. According to Sophie's version of events, Jonathan was the one pursuing her, showing up uninvited and begging for reconciliation, while she nobly tried to be there for him as a friend during his marital difficulties. The cognitive dissonance was almost impressive. Sophie had managed to convince her boyfriend that she was the victim of Jonathan's obsession, while simultaneously bragging to her gym buddies about her conquest. It takes a special kind of sociopathic talent to spin two completely contradictory narratives with such confidence. I sent Adrian everything. Every screenshot Jordan had uncovered, every timeline detail, every piece of evidence that painted a very different picture from the one Sophie had been selling him. His response was swift and decisive. He dumped her publicly on Facebook, posting all the screenshots along with a caption that would have made a prosecutor weep with joy. Ladies, when a man tells you his ex-wife is crazy and obsessed with him, ask yourself why he keeps meeting up with her every weekend. P.S. Sophie, your gym buddies can read these messages too. Hope the book club was worth it. Within hours, book club had become Sophie's permanent nickname throughout our entire social circle. The guys at her gym started calling her that. Her coworkers picked it up, and eventually it spread to every bar, restaurant, and coffee shop in town. Sophie couldn't go anywhere without someone asking about her book club activities with a smirk that suggested they knew exactly what kind of books she'd been reading. The beautiful thing about small-town justice is that once you become a joke, you stay a joke. Jonathan had gone from thinking he was Don Juan to being the town's official punchline, and there was literally nothing he could do about it. Every time someone saw him, they'd think about those screenshots and wonder what other lies he was telling. But the real karmic justice was watching his reaction to Adrian's post. According to Laya, who'd apparently appointed herself as my unofficial intel source, Jonathan had tried to spin the whole thing as revenge from a jealous man who couldn't handle the truth about Sophie's relationship. But the screenshots spoke for themselves, and Jonathan found himself in the impossible position of trying to deny evidence that everyone could see with their own eyes. The comments on Adrian's post were like watching a masterclass in public humiliation. Person after person shared their own Sophie stories. Apparently, this wasn't her first rodeo when it came to manipulating multiple people simultaneously. Jonathan wasn't her first victim, and he probably wouldn't have been her last if Adrian hadn't blown up her entire operation. My personal favorite comment came from a woman named Rachel who wrote, "Sophie told me the same story about her crazy ex-husband 2 years ago. Seems like all her exes are crazy, which is statistically improbable unless the common denominator is her. Meanwhile, my life in London was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more. The work was challenging and rewarding. My apartment was a sanctuary of peace and quiet, and I was finally sleeping through the night without wondering what my husband was texting about at midnight. I joined a local gym where nobody knew my name or my history, started exploring the city like a tourist in my own life, and discovered that happiness wasn't some elusive concept. It was just what happened when you remove toxic people from your daily routine. Every morning, I checked my phone to see the latest updates from the American Disaster Channel, formerly known as My Marriage. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, except the train had derailed months ago and was now just rolling down a hill, collecting more debris with every rotation. And the best part? I was 3,000 miles away, sipping excellent coffee and building a life that actually made sense. It was a Tuesday morning, I remember, because I'd just finished a particularly satisfying meeting with my team about expanding into the European markets, when I walked out of our Canary Wharf office building and nearly choked on my coffee. There, standing next to the fountain like some sort of deranged tourist, was Jonathan, in London. 3,000 miles from where he was supposed to be, looking like he'd been sleeping in airport chairs and living off vending machine snacks. For a moment, I wondered if I was having some sort of stress-induced hallucination. Maybe the combination of jet lag and British weather had finally broken my brain, and I was now seeing my husband's ghost haunting the financial district of my life. But no, he was definitely real. Wrinkled clothes, disheveled hair, and that particular brand of desperation that only comes from making terrible life decisions and doubling down on them. He spotted me before I could duck back into the building and pretend I'd never left. His face lit up with a kind of manic relief usually reserved for people who've been lost in the desert and just spotted an oasis. He waved at me like we were old friends running into each other at a high school reunion, rather than estranged spouses whose marriage had imploded in spectacular fashion. "Trisha," he called out, jogging toward me with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever who'd just seen a tennis ball. "I can't believe I found you. This city is huge." I stood there, coffee cup halfway to my lips, trying to process the sheer audacity of the situation. He'd flown across the Atlantic Ocean to ambush me outside my workplace like some sort of international stalker. The man who couldn't be bothered to skip one Saturday coffee date with his ex-wife had apparently found the motivation to book a transatlantic flight and track me down in a city of 9 million people. "Jonathan," I said finally, my voice carrying all the enthusiasm of someone who'd just discovered a parking ticket on their windshield. "What the hell are you doing here?" He wilted a little at my less than enthusiastic reception, which was rich considering he'd shown up uninvited to my new life, like a walking reminder of every mistake I'd ever made. "I just wanted to talk," he said, his voice doing that wounded puppy thing that used to work on me back when I was stupid enough to care. "Can we get coffee? Please, coffee." Of course, because nothing said reconciliation like recreating the same activity that had destroyed our marriage in the first place. But something about his appearance, the dark circles under his eyes, the desperate way he was clutching his backpack like a life preserver, made me curious about just how far he'd fallen since I'd left. Against my better judgment, which had clearly taken a vacation to somewhere more sensible, I agreed. We found a cafe near the office, one of those trendy London places that served coffee in cups the size of soup bowls and charged accordingly. Jonathan ordered some complicated drink with multiple modifiers, probably trying to delay the inevitable conversation, while I stuck with a simple Americano because I had actual work to get back to. He looked rough, really rough, the kind of rough that comes from weeks of poor decisions and sleepless nights. His usually put-together hair was limp and greasy, his skin looked sallow, and his clothes looked like he'd grabbed them off the floor of his childhood bedroom. This wasn't the confident man who'd been strutting around town with Sophie just a few weeks ago. "You look good," he said, which was probably true. London had been good to me. Better sleep, less stress, and the general glow that comes from not living with someone who makes you question your sanity on a daily basis. "The city suits you." "It does," I agreed, not bothering to return the compliment because honestly, he looked like he'd been hit by a bus carrying regret. He fidgeted with his coffee cup, stirring it obsessively like he was trying to divine the future from the foam patterns. "Trisha, I need you to know that I made a terrible mistake. The worst mistake of my life. I was confused and stupid, and I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me." Here we go. The grand apology tour, complete with self-flagellation and promises of redemption. I'd been expecting this conversation since the day I left, though I'd hoped it would come via email or text message rather than an in-person performance in a London cafe. "I've been miserable since you left," he continued, his voice starting to crack around the edges. "Absolutely miserable. Nothing feels right without you. I can't sleep. I can't eat. I can't concentrate at work. I just keep thinking about all the ways I screwed up and wondering if there's any way to fix this." The thing about apologies is that they work best when they come before the relationship explodes, not after you've been caught red-handed and faced with consequences. Jonathan's remorse felt about as genuine as a $3 bill, timed perfectly to coincide with his realization that the grass wasn't actually greener on Sophie's side of the fence. "What happened with Sophie?" I asked, because I was genuinely curious about how that train wreck had concluded. His face crumpled like a house of cards in a windstorm. "It wasn't what I thought it would be. Once you left, she changed. She became demanding and possessive. She wanted me to move in with her immediately, quit my job, start having kids right away. It was like she thought she owned me or something." Fascinating. Sophie had gone from being the sensitive ex-wife who needed emotional support to a controlling nightmare, the moment she thought she'd won. It was almost like she'd been putting on an act to steal someone else's spouse, and once she'd succeeded, the mask had come off. "So, you broke up?" I pressed. "I tried to," he said, his voice getting smaller, but she didn't take it well. She started showing up at my work, calling me constantly, telling everyone that I was just having commitment issues and would come around. It was like living with a stalker. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Jonathan had left a stable, respectful marriage for a woman who turned out to be exactly the kind of person he'd accused me of being when I questioned his weekend adventures. Life has a funny way of teaching lessons to people who refuse to learn them the easy way. "I'm sorry that happened to you," I said, and I actually meant it. Nobody deserves to be stalked or harassed, not even someone who'd made spectacularly poor choices. But I'm not sure what you expect me to do about it. That's when he dropped the bombshell that made this whole conversation shift from pathetic to absolutely insane. "I'm going to be a father," he whispered, tears starting to flow down his cheeks like a broken faucet. "Sophie's pregnant, and I don't know what to do." The announcement hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud, and for a moment, I genuinely thought Jonathan had finally lost whatever tenuous grip on reality he'd been maintaining. I stared at him across the cafe table, watching tears stream down his face while he waited for my reaction, and all I could think was, this man has officially gone off the deep end. And then, to my own surprise, I started laughing. Not a cruel laugh, not a mocking laugh, but the kind of genuine from-the-belly laughter that happens when someone tells you something so absurd that your brain can't process it any other way. Other cafe patrons started looking over at us, probably wondering if they were witnessing a proposal gone wrong or a mental breakdown in progress. "Pregnant?" I repeated, wiping tears from my eyes. "That's your play here? Really? After everything that's happened, you're going with the pregnancy angle?" His face went through several interesting color changes: confusion, hurt, anger, and then that particular shade of red people get when they realize their lie has been called out publicly. "I'm not lying," he protested, but his voice had that hollow ring that bad actors get when they're overselling their performance. "Jonathan," I said, leaning back in my chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who holds all the cards, "we haven't had sex in over 2 months. I know this because I was there, or rather, I wasn't there, if you catch my drift. You were too busy with your book club activities to be interested in your actual wife." The silence that followed was deafening. He opened and closed his mouth like a fish, gasping for air, clearly trying to come up with some explanation that would make his story believable. But we both knew the math didn't work. "It could be from before," he whispered weakly, but even he didn't sound convinced. "From before what? Before you decided that Sophie was more important than our marriage? Before you started spending every weekend playing house with your ex-wife? Be specific, Jonathan, because my calendar is pretty clear on when we stopped being intimate." He crumpled then, his whole fake pregnancy facade collapsing like a house of cards in a hurricane. The tears kept flowing, but now they seemed more genuine, tears of frustration and desperation rather than manipulative crocodile tears. "I just needed you to care," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ambient cafe noise. "I thought if you believed Sophie was pregnant, you'd want to work things out. You'd remember that you loved me once." And there it was, the truth, wrapped up in the most pathetic package imaginable. Jonathan had flown 3,000 miles to lie to my face about being a soon-to-be father because he thought it would magically erase months of betrayal and manipulation. The man who'd given me an ultimatum about trust was now trying to manipulate me with fake life-changing news. "I did love you once," I said quietly, and for the first time since he'd appeared outside my office, I felt something resembling sadness instead of just irritation. "I loved you for 3 years, but you only noticed when I stopped." He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes, mascara-less and pathetic in a way I'd never seen before. "So what now? You're just going to stay in London forever? Build a whole new life without me?" "That's exactly what I'm going to do," I confirmed, because that's what people do when their marriages end. They move on. They build better lives. They don't chase their ex-spouses across international borders with fake pregnancy stories. Jonathan flew home that night, defeated and broken in ways that almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. But sympathy was a luxury I couldn't afford when it came to someone who'd spent months systematically destroying our marriage and then expected me to fix the consequences of his choices. The real entertainment started after he got back to the States. According to my network of involuntary correspondents, mostly Laya, who seemed to think I needed regular updates on the Jonathan show, My ex-husband had apparently learned nothing from our London conversation and was already back to his old patterns. 2 weeks after his failed reconciliation mission, Jonathan was posting Instagram stories from a CrossFit gym featuring a suspiciously attractive trainer named Damien. Because nothing says I've learned from my mistakes like immediately rebounding with another fitness professional who probably had the emotional depth of a puddle. The Instagram posts were a masterclass in self-deception. Jonathan was suddenly all about self-improvement and working on himself, posting inspirational quotes about how soulmates arrive when you're ready to work on yourself, and the universe brings you what you need when you need it most. The irony was so thick you could package it and sell it as a dietary supplement. Meanwhile, back in London, I was discovering that Karma has a sense of humor that rivals any comedy writer. Sophie, apparently unable to learn from her previous humiliation, had somehow managed to land a job in London. Not just in London, but in the exact same corporate housing building where I was living. The universe was either testing my patience or setting up the world's most elaborate practical joke. I first encountered her in the lobby on a Tuesday morning, looking every bit as smug as I remembered, but now with the added bonus of seeming slightly desperate. She was with a young man who looked like he'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, all jawline and overconfidence. And she introduced him with air quotes that suggested their relationship status was about as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. "Trisha!" Sophie called out like we were long-lost friends instead of bitter enemies. "What are the odds? Small world, right?" Her companion, a 20-something named Damien, gave me a polite nod, clearly unaware that he was standing next to the wreckage of one of the messiest relationship disasters in recent memory. I nodded back, keeping my tone even. "Sophie, Damien, nice to meet you." Because here's the thing I'd learned in London. The best revenge isn't slamming doors or screaming in lobbies. The best revenge is living well, and not engaging with people who've already proven they're not worth your time. By the end of that week, Damien had dumped Sophie in the building's WhatsApp group chat after discovering her illustrious history with married men. Apparently, someone in the building had done their homework and shared the screenshots from Adrian's Facebook post. The message Damien left was a thing of beauty. "Ladies of Riverside Court, Sophie Thompson is a serial cheater who specializes in breaking up marriages. She told me her ex-husband was crazy and obsessed with her. Turns out she was just married to someone else at the time. Also, she cries after sex. You've been warned." Within hours, everyone in our 200-unit building knew Sophie as that woman who cries after sex and breaks up marriages. Her nickname evolved from book club to cry club, and residents started crossing the street to avoid her in the hallways. The beautiful thing about living in corporate housing is that gossip travels faster than Wi-Fi, and Sophie's reputation preceded her everywhere she went. The concierge started smirking when she walked by. The gym staff exchanged knowing looks. Even the cleaning lady gave her side eye that could have melted steel. Justice served with a side of public humiliation. Exactly what the doctor ordered. Meanwhile, back in the good old US of A, Jonathan's relationship with Damien the CrossFit trainer was following the predictable trajectory of all rebound flings that start with Instagram stories and end with restraining orders. According to my unofficial intelligence network, consisting mainly of Laya's inability to keep her mouth shut and my own morbid curiosity, things had gone south faster than a penguin convention. Jonathan had walked into the gym one evening for his regular session with Damien, probably expecting to work on his squats and his emotional baggage simultaneously, when he discovered Damien in the back room helping his ex-girlfriend with some very creative stretching exercises. Now, I'm no fitness expert, but I'm pretty sure that particular position isn't recommended in any legitimate workout manual, unless Damien was pioneering some revolutionary new form of couples yoga that involved significantly less clothing and significantly more betrayal than traditional exercise routines. Jonathan just stood there for 5 minutes, frozen, watching his rebound implode in real time. Damien and his ex were so into their stretching session that they didn't even notice Jonathan standing in the mirror's reflection. The image of him holding his gym bag and water bottle while his second ill-fated relationship unraveled before his eyes? Poetic. When Damien finally noticed him, the ensuing confrontation was legendary enough to become gym folklore. Jonathan, channeling all the righteous indignation he'd never directed at himself, launched into a tirade about trust and respect that left everyone within earshot wondering if they were witnessing performance art or a psychological breakdown. "How could you do this to me?" he he screamed, according to multiple eyewitness accounts that quickly spread through the local gossip network faster than a viral TikTok video. I trusted you. I thought we had something real. The irony was so thick you could have bottled it as a protein shake. Jonathan, the man who'd spent 3 months sneaking around with his ex-wife while married to me, was suddenly an expert on fidelity. The same man who gave me an ultimatum about trust was now devastated to discover his trainer boyfriend was about as trustworthy as he was. But wait, there's more. Because apparently the universe wasn't finished serving up justice with a side of poetic comeuppance. Jonathan, in his emotional distress over Damien's betrayal, made the brilliant decision to text me about his revelation. At 3 a.m. London time, 10:00 p.m., his time, my phone buzzed with a message I initially thought was some sort of drunk dial situation. Now I know how you felt. I'm so sorry. That was it. No context, no explanation, just a sudden burst of empathy that had apparently taken an entire rebound relationship to develop. I stared at the message for a few minutes, marveling at the fact that it had taken Jonathan experiencing betrayal firsthand to understand what betrayal felt like. Revolutionary stuff, really. I left him on read. Not out of cruelty, but because what exactly was I supposed to say? Thanks for finally developing basic human empathy after destroying our marriage? Congratulations on learning a lesson most people figure out in elementary school. There was literally no response that wouldn't either encourage his delusion that we could reconcile or make me sound like a complete bastard. But karma, as it turns out, was just getting warmed up. Because while Jonathan was dealing with his trainer boyfriend's creative stretching exercises, he was about to discover that his past decisions had consequences that extended far beyond broken hearts and damaged pride. Remember Adrian, the paralegal who'd blown up Sophie's entire operation with those glorious Facebook screenshots? Well, Adrian worked in the tax department for the city, and he'd apparently been doing some digging into Jonathan's living situation during their relationship. Turns out Jonathan's clever little scheme of using his parents' address to avoid city taxes while actually living in our apartment had caught someone's attention. Someone with access to employment records, lease agreements, and the kind of bureaucratic dedication that makes the IRS look friendly and approachable. The audit notice arrived on a Tuesday. According to Laya's breathless report, Jonathan had opened what he thought was junk mail, only to discover that the city wanted to have a very serious conversation about his tax obligations for the past 3 years. Specifically, they wanted to know why someone who was employed full-time in the city, had a city-issued parking permit, and was registered to vote at a city address, had been claiming residency in his parents' suburban township. The amount owed was spectacular. 3 years of back taxes, plus penalties, plus interest, plus administrative fees that seemed to multiply like rabbits in springtime. The final tally came to just over $18,000, which might as well have been $18 million for someone who'd been living paycheck to paycheck while spending his disposable income on weekend dates with his ex-wife and later CrossFit classes. Jonathan's parents, bless their enabling hearts, bailed him out financially, but they also forced him to move back into his childhood bedroom as part of the bailout agreement, because apparently even they had limits to how much financial irresponsibility they were willing to subsidize without consequences. The image of Jonathan, at 29 years old, moving back into his teenage bedroom with its faded boy band posters and high school trophies, was almost too perfect to be real. The man who'd been so eager to play house with Sophie every weekend was now literally back in the house where he grew up, under his parents' roof and their rules. He has a curfew now, Leia reported with barely concealed glee. His mom makes him be home by 11 p.m. on weeknights and midnight on weekends. It's like he's 16 again, except with massive debt and a destroyed marriage instead of college applications and prom planning. Meanwhile, my life in London continued to improve in ways that made me question whether I'd stumbled into some sort of alternate universe where good decisions actually led to good outcomes. The promotion I'd been hoping for came through ahead of schedule, along with another salary increase that made my former American income look like pocket change. I was offered a permanent position with the company, complete with visa sponsorship and a clear path to British residency if I wanted it. But the real victory wasn't professional. It was personal. I'd met someone. His name was Evan. He was Irish and worked as an editor for a publishing house in Bloomsbury. Smart, funny, grounded, and refreshingly free of any desire to maintain relationships with his exes. When I told him the book club saga over dinner one evening, He laughed until tears streamed down his face. "Sounds like your husband was reading the wrong chapters," he said. And I knew right then this was someone I wanted to keep around. With Evan, everything was easy. No drama, no secrets, no weekend disappearances, or mysterious text messages. Just two adults building something real together, based on honesty and mutual respect. Revolutionary concepts, apparently. Every time Jonathan saw me with Evan in the building lobby or the local pub, I could see the jealousy eating him alive from the inside. The man who thought he was winning by choosing Sophie was watching me build something better with someone who actually deserved me. Karma, it seemed, had a sense of timing that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep. While Jonathan was navigating the exciting world of parental curfews and tax debt, my life in London had evolved from escape and recovery to thriving in ways I didn't know were possible. It's amazing how much your perspective shifts when you're not constantly wondering if your spouse is lying to you about where they're spending their weekends. Who knew trust and honesty were such game changers in the happiness department? The promotion had come with perks that made my old life look like I'd been living in black and white and someone had suddenly invented color television. Not just the salary bump, though going from comfortable to holy crap, I can actually afford things without checking my bank balance first, was pretty spectacular. But the whole package, company car, expense account, and the kind of professional respect that comes from working with people who view competence as a baseline rather than an aspiration. My team was killing it in the European markets, which apparently made me some sort of corporate golden girl, the kind of success that would have made Jonathan proud back when he was capable of being proud of anything that didn't involve Sophie. Now it just felt like vindication, proof that I'd made the right choice when I walked away from that toxic mess and chose myself for once. But the real transformation wasn't professional. It was Evan. Meeting him had been one of those random London moments that make you believe in cosmic timing. I'd been sitting in a pub in Bloomsbury after a particularly good day at work, reading emails and enjoying a pint, when the man at the next table started laughing at something on his laptop. Not polite chuckling, but the kind of genuine, infectious laughter that makes you want to know what's so funny too. He'd been editing a manuscript, something about a man who thought he could win back his ex-wife by pretending to be a food critic, and the absurdity of the plot had apparently struck him as hilarious. When he noticed me trying not to eavesdrop, he shared the joke, and we ended up talking until the pub closed. Evan was everything Jonathan wasn't. Where Jonathan was all surface-level drama and emotional manipulation, Evan was substance and authenticity. He said what he meant what he said, and had never once made me wonder if he was secretly texting someone else while sitting next to me. Revolutionary concepts, apparently. He was also funny in ways that didn't require an audience or social media validation. When I told him the whole book club saga over dinner one night, he listened with the kind of attention that suggested he was actually interested in understanding what had happened, rather than just waiting for his turn to talk. "So, let me get this straight," he said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "Your ex-husband spent 3 months cheating on you with his ex-wife, gave you an ultimatum about trusting him, and then flew to London to lie about being a father when you took him up on that ultimatum?" "That's the condensed version, yes." "And now he's living with his parents because he got caught committing tax fraud?" "Also yes." "Sounds like your husband was reading the wrong chapters," he said again. That line became our private joke. Anytime we encountered relationship drama, in movies, books, or real life, one of us would comment about people reading the wrong chapters. With Evan, everything was refreshingly normal. We traveled together without it becoming a logistical nightmare or an excuse for Instagram content. We cooked together without turning it into a competition or a therapy session. We built something real based on actually liking each other as people, rather than just being addicted to the drama and chaos that some people mistake for passion. The contrast wasn't lost on me, especially when I'd see Sophie around the building. Poor Sophie, who'd gone from thinking she was the star of her own romantic drama to being the punchline of everyone's jokes. The woman couldn't walk through the lobby without someone making a book club reference or asking if she needed tissues. Her professional life in London hadn't exactly flourished either. Word travels fast in corporate circles, especially when someone has a reputation for being the kind of person who breaks up marriages for sport. Sophie's career trajectory had gone from promising transfer to "why is she still here?" in record time. But the real entertainment came from watching her try to process seeing me happy, actually genuinely happy, not just pretending to be fine while dying inside. When Sophie saw me with Evan, laughing at his jokes, holding his hand, looking like someone who'd finally figured out what healthy relationships were supposed to feel like, the jealousy in her eyes was absolutely priceless. This was the woman who thought she was winning by taking Jonathan back, the woman who bragged about it to her friends, who strutted around town like she'd scored some great victory. Now she was watching me build something infinitely better with someone who actually deserved me, while she lived alone in corporate housing with a reputation that followed her like a bad smell. The irony was beautiful. Sophie had gotten exactly what she wanted, Jonathan, and discovered that winning a prize nobody else wants isn't actually winning at all. Meanwhile, I'd lost something I thought I wanted to keep and found something infinitely better in the process. Evan and I started talking about making things permanent. Not in the rushed, desperate way people do when they're trying to fix something broken, but in the calm, confident way that happens when you find someone who makes sense. British residency, long-term plans, the kind of future building that actually felt exciting rather than terrifying. The company had offered to sponsor my permanent residency, which would put me on track for British citizenship if I wanted it. The idea of officially cutting ties with my old life, of literally becoming a citizen of a different country, felt like the ultimate fresh start. Not running away from my problems, but graduating from them into something better. Every weekend with Evan was a reminder of what weekends were supposed to feel like. No mystery plans, no secret meetings, no wondering if the person you loved was lying to your face about where they were going. Just two people who enjoyed each other's company, building memories instead of collecting secrets. We'd take day trips to Bath or Brighton, explore different neighborhoods in London, or just spend lazy Sundays reading in bed while rain pattered against the windows. Simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after 3 years of marriage to someone who treated our relationship like a part-time job. He was constantly trying to quit. And the best part? Sophie got to watch it all unfold since we lived in the same building. Every time she saw us together, coming back from a weekend trip, heading out for dinner, or just walking through the lobby, looking like people who actually liked each other, I could see it eating away at her. This was the life she thought she was destroying when she tempted Jonathan away from me. Instead, she'd done me the biggest favor of my life by removing someone who was never going to make me happy and clearing the path for someone who actually could. Karma, it turned out, had a sense of poetry that would make Shakespeare weep with envy. Looking back on this whole cluster of a year, I have exactly one regret: not taking the London job the first time they offered it to me. Not the second time either, but definitely not the first time. I could have saved myself months of watching my marriage decompose like roadkill in the summer heat. Months of pretending that Jonathan's weekend book club activities were anything other than a slow-motion betrayal set to the soundtrack of my own denial. The truth is, I'd been sacrificing pieces of myself for someone who never valued the sacrifice. While I was turning down dream opportunities and restructuring my entire future around Jonathan's unwillingness to leave his precious hometown, he was busy restructuring his weekends around his ex-wife's emotional needs. The math never worked in my favor, but I'd been too invested in the sunk cost fallacy to notice. You know what's funny about hindsight? It's not just 20/20. It's high-definition, IMAX quality clarity that makes you wonder how you ever missed the obvious signs that your life was turning into a daytime soap opera. Every red flag I'd ignored, every excuse I'd accepted, every time I'd chosen to trust someone who was systematically proving himself untrustworthy, it all looked so painfully clear from my Thames View apartment in London. Jonathan's social media presence these days is a masterclass in performative healing. He posts cryptic inspirational quotes that divorced people love so much. You know the ones: growth through pain, stronger than yesterday. The universe removes people from your life to make room for better things, all with comments turned off, because apparently enlightenment doesn't include being open to feedback. My personal favorite was his recent post about learning to love yourself before you can love someone else, which was rich coming from someone who spent our entire marriage seeking validation from every woman except his actual wife. But hey, if Instagram quotes about self-discovery help him sleep at night in his childhood bedroom, more power to him. Sophie's online presence, meanwhile, has become virtually non-existent. The woman who used to post gym selfies and motivational content about grinding and winning has gone dark. Probably because it's hard to maintain a personal brand around success when everyone knows you as book club or cry club, depending on which scandal they remember better. Last I heard through the London corporate housing gossip network, she'd been trying to transfer back to the States, but apparently her reputation had followed her across the Atlantic like a particularly persistent curse. Turns out breaking up marriages and crying after sex aren't exactly the kind of qualifications that make HR departments excited about internal transfers. The beautiful thing about karma is that it doesn't just serve justice, it serves justice with style. Sophie had thought she was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, but it turned out she was actually playing Russian roulette with her own reputation, while everyone else was just living their lives like functional adults. And me? I'm building a life that actually makes sense. A life with someone who doesn't need an ex to feel complete, who doesn't mistake drama for passion, who thinks the concept of book club as code for cheating is as ridiculous as it actually is. Evan and I are planning a trip to Ireland next month to meet his family, which feels like the kind of normal relationship milestone that Jonathan and I never managed to achieve without turning it into a crisis or an excuse for him to reconnect with someone from his past. It's amazing how simple things become when you're with someone who actually wants to be with you. The visa paperwork for permanent residency is moving along faster than expected, which means I'll officially be a British resident by the end of the year. There's something poetic about legally cutting ties with the country where my marriage imploded and officially becoming a citizen of the place where I finally figured out how to be happy. To all the people back home who said I should have fought harder for Jonathan, I have one question. Why? Why fight for someone who gave me an ultimatum about trusting him while he was busy proving himself untrustworthy? Why battle for a marriage with someone who was already emotionally checked out and planning his next relationship? Fighting for your marriage makes sense when both people want to save it. It's romantic and noble and all those things that look good in movies. But fighting to keep someone who doesn't want to be kept is just elaborate self-harm disguised as love. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go, so they can discover firsthand that the grass isn't actually greener on the other side. Jonathan wanted to explore his options. I gave him that opportunity by removing myself as an option. He wanted to see if Sophie was worth more than our marriage. I let him find out. He wanted freedom from our relationship. I provided it, along with a front row seat to watch what that freedom actually looked like in practice. The universe has a twisted sense of humor, but it also has impeccable timing. Every time I look out at the Thames from my apartment, or book a weekend trip to Paris with Evan, or get another promotion at work, I'm reminded that choosing yourself isn't selfish. It's necessary. You can't build a life worth living on the foundation of someone else's indifference. Jonathan is living in his childhood bedroom, dealing with tax debt and parental supervision because he chose drama over stability. Sophie's reputation is so toxic that even LinkedIn recruiters probably cross the street when they see her profile. And I'm planning Christmas market tours with someone who thinks my jokes are actually funny and doesn't need to check his phone every 5 minutes to feel validated. The math works out pretty clearly when you actually do the calculation. I don't hate Jonathan anymore. Hate requires too much emotional energy, and frankly, I've got better things to do with my feelings these days. I don't even feel sorry for him, because everything that happened was the direct result of his own choices. He wanted to play adult games, and he won adult prizes. If anything, I'm grateful. Grateful that he was foolish enough to give me that ultimatum. Grateful that he made his priorities so obvious that even my denial couldn't rationalize them away. Grateful that he freed me from a marriage that was slowly killing everything good about who I used to be. Sometimes people do you the biggest favor of your life by showing you exactly who they are. Jonathan showed me he was someone who would choose his ex-wife over his actual wife, someone who would lie and manipulate and blame everyone else for the consequences of his actions. And in showing me who he really was, he also showed me who I could become, someone who refuses to settle for less than she deserves, someone who chooses happiness over familiarity, someone who finally learned that you can't love someone into being worthy of that love. Every morning when I wake up in London in my beautiful apartment with my beautiful life and my beautiful partner who actually wants to be there, I smile and think the same thing. I finally chose myself, and it was the best decision I ever made.